Donc bienvenue dans ce nouveau séminaire d'architecture de la chaire de philosophie à l'hôpital. Donc, qui, comme vous le savez, comme vous le savez peut-être pas, donc on est à sa troisième année et se passe depuis l'année dernière sur l'Adamant. Lieu dans lequel on entretient l'héritage de la psychothérapie institutionnelle et lieu dans lequel on a décidé avec Cynthia Fleury il y a à peu près une année de venir faire nos cours ici parce que ça avait évidemment beaucoup de sens pour nous de venir parler des relations entre espace et soins dans un lieu tel que l'Adamant. Je vous invite à revoir la séance dans laquelle on a reçu Éric Piel et Gérard Ronzati, l'architecte de l'Adamant, qui explique le concept d'ambiance et comment ils ont voulu eux-mêmes fabriquer un lieu qui participe aux soins. Donc, il reste 2 séances cette année avant l'année prochaine qui va redémarrer ici. Il nous reste 2 séances cette année. La prochaine séance aura lieu le 1er juin. Donc, ce sera la dernière avec Peter Versteeg que j'ai vu en ligne et Catherine Versteeg-Cellier. Qui vont nous parler notamment d'expérimentation, de co-construction d'architecture avec des patients dans des hôpitaux psychiatriques en Suisse. Ils ont tous les deux écrit un très beau livre qui s'appelle Alcove. Et là, ils ont fabriqué ce qu'ils ont appelé des folies avec des patients, avec des soignants dans des contextes psychiatriques. Donc ça sera notre très belle dernière séance donc dans 3 semaines, je crois. Et aujourd'hui, je reçois Gideon Boie ou Gideon Boie, selon la prononciation que vous voudrez. Voilà, ça fait longtemps qu'on doit le recevoir. On a reporté 2 fois parce qu'il avait chaque fois choisi des journées de mobilisation contre la réforme des retraites. Mais il est enfin là aujourd'hui. Les mobilisations en plus n'a servi à rien, donc tout ça pour ça. Qui est donc architecte, philosophe et qui travaille en Belgique, qui est professeur à l'université de Louvain, spécialiste de relations entre architecture et care, architecture et soins, et notamment dans l'histoire de la psychiatrie en Belgique, ce qui permet aussi de décaler le regard par rapport à ce qu'on connaît en France. Donc, il est fondateur d'un collectif de recherche qui s'appelle Bavo, un collectif qui travaille sur l'architecture. Et il est notamment co-auteur avec les architectes ADVVT d'un projet via lequel j'ai connu son travail et qu'on avait montré à l'exposition au pavillon de l'Arsenal, qui est la transformation d'un pavillon du centre psychiatrique Caritas près de Gand en Belgique, qui est un projet qui est vraiment exceptionnel et qui vraiment manifeste d'une certaine démarche de réparation qu'on applique solidairement aux patients et à l'espace. Et voilà, c'est un projet qui a été très remarqué. Merci beaucoup et merci beaucoup, Gideon, d'être venu jusqu'à Paris pour nous. Et je te laisse la parole en français. Si tu veux switcher, n'hésite pas.
Donc, bonsoir à tous. I want to switch to English if it's no problem. I'm I'm more at ease in English. Coming from Belgium, well, it's always the case, but don't hesitate to post questions in French. Donc, so I'm Dutch speaking. In Belgium, we have this common habit of all speaking our own language. So we have a sort of Babylonic language confusion in the same room. I understand in France, this is of course a bit more rare, but that's the beauty of Belgium. But I only have one native Dutch-speaking person with me, so I'll switch to English. Eric asked me to talk about the Caritas project. This is the project that you see behind me. Let me first show you this project in a few images. It's a central It's a building in the psychiatric center Caritas in Melle, near Ghent. It's about 20 minutes from the city of Ghent. It is part of the psychiatric hospital run by the Sisters of Mercy. It was the ladies or the female clinic for psychiatry built in 1904 as a sort of complement to the male psychiatric clinic in Ghent, most known, the Dr. Gislin Institute, which was run by the Brothers of Mercy. The psychiatric clinic in Melle was quite a modern facility in the sense that it had a sort of open terrain with pavilions spread over the terrain. For every mental sickness, there was a pavilion assigned. And the building we will talk about is the St. Joseph, or the former St. Joseph pavilion. It was called the Pavilion for the Troubled Woman, so, or the onrustige vrouwen. So I think we would call them hysterics today. So this was the mindset of that time. And every pavilion had was assigned a mental illness. So, but what the project I show you is the former St. Joseph Pavilion. It became what we call now the Canonic Petrus Joseph Triest Square. Canonic Petrus Joseph Triest was the founder of the clinic, also the founder of the Dr. Gislin Clinic, and in Belgium, a famous person active in psychiatry at that time. And it stood, the building stood abandoned for almost 10-15 years. The abandoned building was opened up as a monumental outdoor space without any real function. So in that sense, by purpose, we gave it the name of a square, on place. It is just about that, just about providing a square in the heart of the clinic without a proper function, without a specific function. It has 2 levels. It was opened up. Now the upper 2 floors are closed because of safety reasons, because the building, of course, now after almost 8 years of being open, starts to deteriorate. Of course, that was part of the plan, that a building that we would not demolish the building straight away, but that we allow it, let's say, somehow to rot and to decay, and have that as a sort of central building in the psychiatric center. The project gained, as Eric said, a lot of international attention. It's a rare project, of course, also in a functioning psychiatric clinic, so something quite strange. We got prizes from the Venice Biennial, the Silver Lion. We got a prize for the Mies van der Rohe Award in Barcelona. We even got a prize by the European Union Public Prize for urban public space. So imagine this building, in fact, getting prizes in all different categories. In Belgium, we even got a prize by the Henri van der Velde prize for interior space. So very strange. But what I want to talk about is, or strange enough, so all these prizes, this massive attention, people all having their own interpretation of what that building could mean for the patients. Often it was explained like that, a sort of healing environment. But this was strange for us as initiators of the project. But at first we did not have any there was no idea of healing in that project. The project, this is what I will explain now. In fact, it was just having this open space in the clinic. And of course, the perception, public perception was a lot about this care, about this healing element. But for us in the clinic, the project did not solve, in fact, anything. It was a sort of byproduct, a line of light that came into being during the reflection we had on the spatial organization of the the clinic. And in that context, the opportunity came to save one of the older buildings and have it open up as a sort of ruin. So it was part of this bigger research on what spatial setting would mean today for the psychiatric clinic. And this is what I want to talk about and how this connects to the project that we see here behind me. So, in fact, the project started with me as architect, philosopher, working on the issue of psychiatry and the space for psychiatry, or the architecture for psychiatry. That work started was initiated by the Flanders Architecture Institute and the Flemish government architects, having the wish to reflect on this issue. So the question, what could architecture for care mean? But in fact, there were no best practices, or they could not find any best practice, and still they had this ambition to somehow work around that theme. So in the policy notes, very general reflections were made, like this idea of invisible care, that this should be the architecture for the future when it comes to care, in a sort of architecture that is invisible, so that you do not have this, let's say, this hospital complexes anymore, in which it is somehow clear from the outset that you are a sick person, the moment even entering that clinic. But in fact, this was a very general idea, because the moment you start to differentiate and the moment you start to think about psychiatry, often it's not that easy to become invisible. For instance, when talking about crisis care, you cannot simply become invisible, and you cannot simply become part of the city. Another of these very general ideas was a slogan by the Flemish government architecture for care and care for architecture. So the idea was that if we want to have an architecture for care, we should also start to care for architecture. But this was, of course, a very good, a nice idea, but you could do little with that in terms of when it comes to this. When it comes to therapy, when it comes to residential programs in the clinics and all of that. So this is where my work started. I started to do case studies on architecture for care in Flanders for the Flemish Architecture Institute, and then starting to have these case studies published for the Psyche magazine, which was a magazine published by the Flemish Association for Mental Healthcare, today called Psyche, as the magazine. The idea was there to formulate what we call in architecture design intelligence. Design intelligence is something that Michael Speaks coined as a term. His argument was, let's say, intelligent design does not come from heroic forms or it does not stem from massive concepts. It's something that is constructed as part of the everyday. He called it from the chatter. The chatter, you could say, the chatter in a clinic. Psychologists talking with therapists, with the facility manager, maybe even bringing patients along around the table to talk about the future facilities they need. So against, let's say, this sort of idea of architecture against the big concept, something like healing environment. This is something, when talking about care and architecture, I'm sure every article will mention the healing environment. To me, it's interesting to know that Charles Jenks, he's a famous architecture historian, one of the giants in architecture history. passed away recently. He started an initiative for hospitality houses for people in cancer treatment. So these were no buildings without any treatment program, but a sort of hospitality for the patients. It was always built in as an annex to the bigger NHS hospitals in Great Britain. These were buildings designed by the most famous architects, because, of course, him being a very important architecture historian, he somehow organized all the his good relations. So you have wonderful houses, hospitality houses, or his hospices, designed by Zaha Hadid, by Rem Koolhaas, by Richard Rogers, by Franco Gehry. So give me a big name of an architect you know, and it was part of his program. So, and at a certain moment, he was asked, "What is this a healing environment? Does the healing environment exist?" He suddenly shied away because he knew he was involved because his wife died because of cancer, and that's why he started that whole initiative. And of course, then having this very big question, healing environment, of course, he was very humble and saying he could not even answer the question. That was an interesting interview on BBC radio. And interesting is that the doctor, who joined the interview, was stepping in and saying, "Yeah, maybe the buildings that were built by the Maggie Foundation." So Charles Jenks started the Maggie Foundations. Maggie was his wife. He stepped in saying, maybe it does not heal the patient, but I'm sure it has a healing effect because the staff, the people working there, feel better. And if they feel better, I'm sure it will have an effect on the patients. So just to say, in fact, this huge idea of healing environment, even a person like Charles Jenks, having built so many of these houses to welcome people in cancer treatment, could not even answer that question, or was at least humble enough to shy away from that. So this was the idea for me. Let's write about the architecture of care, have case studies, have talks with the architects, but also with the commissioners, with the people working in the facilities, with the patients, and have that part and create the discourse that the Flanders Architecture Institute was looking for. One of the talks I had in this very early moment was an interesting talk with a psychologist, Tom Verhagen. He said, the quote always remained in my head. He said, "Architecture is the unconscious for psychiatry." He said, it's somehow strange that we, in psychiatry, we somehow analyze everything. Every word is turned upside down, reflected to behavior of people. But when it comes to architecture and the spatial setting we work in, it is simply there. And we complain about it, but I'm sure that when every new hospital is realized, the same things we complain about it will reappear. So one of these typical architectural elements is the nurse post at the end of the corridor with rooms on both sides, cabinets or sleeping rooms. And then at the end, you have the nurse post. Of course, there's a lot of, or you can say a lot about it. Good things, bad things, benefits and problems. But that was his point. So we often complain about it, why maybe in psychiatry you do not need such a nursing post. You do not need this watching eye over the corridor. You do not need this place where patients always go to, waiting to have some attention or simply stand there. But it will always reappear. Same with the seclusion room. There's a massive debate about it in psychiatry. Do we still need it? How should it look like? Do we maybe need other sort of rooms for people in severe crisis? But in the end, when a new building is realized, the seclusion room will reappear. So the seclusion room, you know what it is, this very small claustrophobic spaces, 4x4, linoleum on all sides, bed for fixation, with a toilet and then a sort of clinical unit in the unit. So that was the argument of this psychologist, saying architecture is somehow the unconscious of psychiatry. And it is there. We have to deal with it. Often when a new building is realized, we immediately starting to think about how to renovate this new building because it's somehow not adapted to our functioning, and we're in constant struggle with that. So this was my first step, how I came, or what my involvement was in psychiatry. Then came in 2014 the request by the manager, the general manager of the clinic, psychiatric center Caritas. It's today called Carus, asking me to work on a new spatial master plan for the clinic. It was, of course, a miscast. I was not active in that sort of architectural work. I was mainly writing as a philosopher on architecture for psychiatry. But still, I took the commission, or we started the work. And the plan was to do that work, the vision development for a new spatial master plan, but not with me as architect, let's say, somehow directing that process, but by bringing everyone in the clinic together. So it was in fact the same plan I had for writing articles, talking with everyone involved in a facility, but then now in real saying, okay, let's have all these people together around the table. So we're talking about psychiatrists, managers, the staff, the therapists, and also the patients, of course. And then we set up a whole choreography of roundtables for every treatment program in the clinic. We started to talk about what architecture could mean in their specific program. These are a few older images from 1904. The good old days. This was the open day. It was a one day in a year. I don't think it was every day like this. So this was the proposal. So let's have that work for around the spatial master plan, but then as a sort of interactive process, because in the end I was not that planner. I could not even direct that. We started to invite the different let's say treatment programs. So this was the ASAP, which means the fear and mood disorder program. And then the second work group mentions the gerontopsychiatry. So it's this elderly psychiatry. And we brought these people together to talk about architecture, what it means, how they relate to the building they work in, what their future facility would better look like, or So all their specific needs, desires, frustrations. This was what we discussed, and then tried to note down and also to visualize, to bring to match with images. The idea was to common the clinic, you know. So instead of having an architect as an expert arriving at the clinic to design the master plan, to have that work done together as a commons. The theory of the commons was something I was busy with. The commons is a sort of third term between public-private. Maybe rare to say commoning the clinic, but we thought it could work. I mean, at least people live and work quite closely around or together in a clinic, and they have a strong attachment with the space, often a negative attachment, but still it makes sense to organize a clinic as a commons, as something that we share. So we set up a process. We used the different people as commoners, as people joining the process of commoning. As you see, we were having a space. We tried to have that work of master planning and architectural planning out of the boardrooms. We were located in. This was a sort of UFO-like building on the site. It's the restaurant. So we were having a side room of the restaurant. So it was the place where people went to every day at noon to have their meal, in the afternoon to have coffee. So we tried to have that work on the spatial master plan in plain sight of everyone at the clinic. Here on the wall, you see the sort of per treatment program. We tried to visualize also the things people were talking about. So when complaining about something in their facility, we try to immediately match it with images, and then also find intersections between the different treatment programs. So a few of the learnings, part of the work was also then making reports on the issues discussed about in the workshops. It was important, or I thought it was important. Why? Because it's one thing to have the report of a workshop as a document circulating in a clinic, but having it published in the Psyche magazine, so the Flemish Association for Mental Health, suddenly meant something for the people active in it. It showed that their talk was taken serious by synthesizing it, by creating knowledge around it. And it also, of course, created a sort of feedback loop on the management in the clinic. Again, also for them, it was quite something different hearing my debriefing or reading my debriefing in a magazine. So one of the ideas was the people complain about in psychiatric center was what we called the hospital psychasthenia. Donc, psychasthenie à l'hôpital. So it's a sort of, it was a situation described by the geographer Edward Soya, psychasthenie, something that happens to you often when you were in a sort of big hotel lobby. You know? Suddenly you disappear in the space. You enter for the first time and you do not immediately know where you have to go to or what people are addressing. And maybe the same as impression I had today when I arrived from Brussels in Paris, Gare du Nord. So you lose yourself, or it's difficult to find the right direction So this was something that people complained about over the different treatment programs. The psychasthenia, when arriving in the clinic, often it's solved with science on the campus, or by people directing newcomers. So one of the staff would help people addressing or finding the right pavilion in the psychiatric center. Often, you know how it works in hospitals. There are lines on the floor. So at the lobby, they say, follow the red line, and then you will arrive at the psychosis program, and then follow the green line, and then you will enter, or you will find your way to the day therapy, etc. This was something very specific, as I said, over the different programs. Another issue was what people complained about was what they called the shooting field. This big green ocean, the ocean of empty green in the clinic. So this very modern layout of the clinic. Let me find. Yeah. But so in this sort of modern, it was quite modern to have different pavilions, not in a monastery-like setup, but dispersed setting. But in this sort of setting, every pavilion had its specific function. So the moment you're out of the building, there's no meaning, no function anymore in this grass field. And there's also no reason to knock the door of one of the other facilities. So this was a sort of common complaint by most, that there was nothing to do in the clinic. So you had then this very specific behavior that patients having a smoke somehow stay very close to the door of their pavilion. There was also an issue of, I remember an elderly patient. He was located here in Jericho building. He had to go to the revalidation center on the other side of the street. He said, the moment I arrived by the St. Joseph Pavilion, I already had my revalidation activity. So they rather put me in the wheelchair because I never arrived at the revalidation center here. So these were the typical complaints about this in-between zone, the nothingness. It's the space where you disappear, where nothing happens. Also, a very specific discussion was in what the psychiatry, how the psychiatric center is linked with the environment. As you see here, the surroundings, Ghent is, let's say, up north of this image. You see in the corner the highway connecting Ghent and Brussels. And then often you have this idea that psychiatry should re-socialize, so relink with urban society. But as you see, there is no urban environment, or at least no real urban environment. You have a bit of industrial activities. University of Ghent, one of the faculties located there. So it brought us to this idea that often this idea of resocialization starts from the conception of psychiatry as a sort of island, a heterotopia, an other place outside society. So this was how Michel Foucault defined the heterotopia of what he called deviation. So all people with a deviation are brought together in another space outside the city. But here, in fact, we came to a totally different idea of this heterotopia. Maybe not so much a heterotopia of deviation, but the heterotopia of compensation. Michel Foucault said in, I think it was the 5th or the 6th principle of heterotopia, that the heterotopia is as organized as our society is muddled, is disorganized. And then the heterotopia of compensation is perfectly organized. He also gives the example of the colony or the military, or maybe the monastery is the best example. So perfectly organized community in which everyone has a well-organized day activity. Everyone has a bed to sleep. Everyone has a specific work. So we came to this conclusion in the workshop that maybe we should start to think of the psychiatric center not as a heterotopia of deviation, more of compensation. And when it's a compensation, it's in fact the same urban, you see in the psychiatric center, the same layout as, let's say, urban layout in Belgium or in Flanders. A parcelization, a sort of urbanity where everyone lives in a specific house and then with sort of empty spaces in between. So when you start from that conception, the challenge is not so much to link up, but maybe to do the same as we do in urban society, to start differentiate the program of the clinic. It's more thinking about what happens here inside. Why is the clinic so monofunctional? Why is there nothing else organized? Why is there no program or facilities in a clinic that houses something different than just a treatment program? Another finding or something that we experienced in this workshop where people complained about was this demolition program. So the vision development program had in the backdrop a new build program foreseen for a crisis department and a department for children and youth psychiatry. So this was, let's say, on the horizon. And that made or created the need to come up with a sort of broader vision on the campus. Part of that was also a demolition program. So 4 buildings were up for demolition. So the Gideon building, Dante building, St. Joseph building, and the Old Wash house. So the new build program was not defined yet. We were only, let's say, in this very early phase of the master planning, spatial master planning, but the demolition program was already started. The contracts were signed, the demolition could start every day. So this created also a sort of background to the discussions we had when having this while in the process of the workshop, this building of the Gideon was demolished. It took 1 week to put the building down, and then another week to clear the site. So the new building program was not defined yet, but it was already clear that these buildings had to go. Here you see how that functions. This was a document that I found in the archives. So it's a very typical model of building development. You take away one building and you put something new instead. So you see the fact that this was another similar building as that stood here. Here was the villa of the head psychiatrist, and then the villa of the head sister. That was the old entrance, and then here was another villa. So this was the building logic. You take away one building and put one instead. So for that reason, without yet having the master plan, there was a decision taken to demolish this, let's say, central axis of the clinic. The perverse logic behind was what we call in Belgium the 75% rule, which means the government will not subsidize projects when the renovation cost is 75% of a new building. So then the government will only subsidize the new building. But of course, any hospital, any management, also every architect working in that around that issue will somehow push to have the full 100%. Why would you? No. So the logic of saving money, government money, has this perverse effect of sort of how would you say, turning circus of demolition and new building in a clinic. I mean, turning circus in the sense of when the one demolition is done, you start demolishing the other and building a new facility instead. And then in that sense, you go around in the clinic. So this was the sort of process we were going through, having discussions on architecture and architecture for psychiatry, and then create a discourse around that in the clinic, come with a sort of general findings, come up with master plans as you see here. I will not go into detail discussing these master plans, but this is the sort of activity we were doing. So this is master planning, talking about space. It's something difficult to grasp. It's a process. It changes often because there's a new subsidy program, or there's a new treatment program brought to the clinic, or beds are exchanged. In fact, also one of the complaints was about the beds. I don't know whether in France it works like that. The bed is a calculation unit for subsidies from the government. The beds meaning in a residential program, a clinic is allowed to have, I don't know, 20 beds for psychosis care, 30 beds for youth care, 5 beds for forensic care, and this is where the clinics deal with. So they are allowed to have X amount of beds, and then often they exchange with other hospitals. It's a sort of market that is created. But often when it comes to architecture, you see literally this bad logic. Yeah? A building, of course, has then 20 beds, and then this allows the clinic to have this specific program. So the building is often not more than just a translation of this bad logic. So, but having this, doing this master planning is difficult to already see something happening. This sort of processes take 10 years, 15 years. We started in 2014. This first, or the crisis building that was discussed back then is only now starting, or last year. The architect was, let's say, having that work done. So this is master planning. This is a very long stretched process. Once when I was complaining about the fact that it takes so long, I remember that the head psych, I was sort of having my neurosis and that in that moment, and the head psychiatrist came to me, he was an older man, saying, but Gideon, look around, nothing has changed, and yet everything looks different. Why? Because he was so enthusiastic about having these workshops, not only he, but also in the clinic. He said, in fact, the whole clinic is talking about architecture and space and what people need and what people would like to see. So, but still, in such a program, of course, I understand the good words or the good advice by this head psychiatrist, but still difficult to grasp and have immediate effects. So this is where the project, the Canonitrice Square, comes to the fore. At a certain moment in the process of these workshops and master planning, we arrived at one point in which the whole process was done over again. So the director called it a recursive moment. So the recursive moment is in a linear process, you come at one moment and then you recap everything in a compressed, maybe heightened speed. And of course, it's not a total repetition. Something changed in the meantime. In our case, of course, this context of demolition became part of the discussions. At first, this was already decided. The contracts were signed. The money was somehow spent. The first building, the Gideon building, when that building was demolished, so it stood aside, it stood here. It was somehow not very clear, but the moment the demolition of the St. Joseph building started, everyone was affected. It had somehow an emotional impact on everyone. Again, also because the St. Joseph Pavilion was very close to the restaurant, so you could see every day how the demolition proceeded. So this was the St. Joseph building and the demolition. It started, or the discussion on this demolition and putting into question whether the demolition should continue started with a photography project. I asked a photographer or the idea was to photograph the demolition in the different stages and have that documented as part of the, I thought when thinking about master planning and architecture for psychiatry, we should have that also documented. But this started to have its own life. These documents started to spread. People were becoming more clear about their frustrations of having that building demolished. Also, this was a therapist, a creative therapist who worked with patients then around the demolitions and started to document with them. She was an amateur photographer. But these were works by the patients. Psychiatric patients with the mental handicap. So interestingly, having these discussions, or when this discussion on demolition came at the table, or was possible to discuss, suddenly all former points on the agenda became reflected on that one building, on the St. Joseph building. So when talking about an in-between space, so people started to discuss, yes, but why not keeping parts of this ruin and make it a sort of gathering place? We could have a smoke there. We could have our revalidation therapy there. I remember, so the in-between space, there were different thoughts about it. I remember someone asking for a wishing wall. Well, first there were two elderly ladies at our table in day therapy. She was drinking coffee and having biscuits, and she asked, "But make it a wailing wall, like in Jerusalem." So this wall of the temple, where you can wail and put your messages in, let's say, in the bricks. And then the lady next to her, I think she was 70, around 70 years. She said something like, "There's enough railing in the clinic. Give me a wishing wall." So that idea of a wishing wall was, of course, again, also creating enthusiasm. It's difficult to negate this sort of ideas, for sure, when it comes from patients. There were other ideas. So the youngsters, of course, had wild ideas what to do in this sort of ruins. But the point is, all the different, let's say, discussion points we had earlier were reflected on this screen. That one building suddenly became the thing. And the bigger thing. So what we did in the workshop was then write a project definition of a half-abandoned ruin, something like an English park where you have this former churches or castles as a ruin. And we made a sort of bricolage of all the desires that we heard. This is an idea of Doina Petrescu, Romanian philosopher, architect, working here in Paris too. She called it a bricolage of desire, or the thing that's when in commoning, you should, or a participative process should construct. So it was that idea that I had in mind when constructing this project definition, making it a bricolage, putting this all together in the building, the wishing wall, the in-between space, the space for smoke, space to do nothing, and have that translated in this sort of this fantasy of how the St. Joseph building in the Caritas Center kept in partial state. It could be a hiding place, it could be whatever. One of the interesting places in the clinic was said a patient in psychosis care often went to the cemetery of the sisters. It was here in the back. It was an interesting place, they said. Why? Because you could hide behind the bushes, but the bushes were not that high. It was just 1 meter, 1.5 meters. So they were outside, but still in a sort of confined space. And so while sitting there, reading a book, one was also saying often making love with his friend there, they could also see other people approaching. So it was a safe space for them. So it was also this sort of space that we had in mind with the ruin, to create something like different spaces in that heart, in the heart of the clinic. Because it was a project definition that came from these workshops, of course, it was very hard then it created a sort of general enthusiasm among everyone. Also the manager got enthusiastic, the psychiatrists or the head psychiatrist. So when we brought it to the board, it was accepted. Of course, again, because it created a sort of this enthusiasm among everyone, even though it was a very rare and almost lunatic idea. Again, as you see, it was already published before it was accepted by the board. I was criticized, but my argument was, it's just an idea. Why can we not publish the ideas as I did before? So even if it's not accepted, this is not a proposal to the board. But of course, then after or later, it was accepted by the board. The demolition contracts were renegotiated. Of course, everyone at first was very reluctant. The head psychiatrist was psychiatrist was, of course, thinking about the safety in the clinic, and then everyone had a say. But the demolition contractor, he said, yes, I can demolish, but for the same amount of money, I can keep parts. Why not? He was the most easy guy in the discussions. So we renegotiated the contracts and put out a tendering, and this was the project definition. One of these ideas was a sort of hortus conclusus with the cemetery of the sisters in mind. The yearly open day. This was an old church in west of Belgium, changed into an open space. Sort of a fountain, an artwork. So this was the idea here, to have that realized at St. Joseph. As you see, we also had wild fantasies for the washing house, but that is not realized. So one of the guiding ideas here was the logic or the words by Parsifal, only one weapon can heal the wounds. It is the spear that haunted you. So in that sense, the building, in fact, it was almost nothing. It had no use. But for us, for me, it was also a possibility to open that strange wound of the clinic, to make visible all these different discussions we had about psychasthenia, about spaces to hide, spaces to smoke, spaces to make love together. Also, the strange demolition and building logic. You could say it's a sort of building neurosis that drives the clinic. So to have that in clear eyes, that was in fact one of the main ideas for us, to have that as a sort of symptom in the clinic, visible for the time being, because of course it after 10 years it starts now, or the wooden floor starts to rot seriously. So we're not sure what will happen in the future years. So this was the tendering program. We asked 3 architecture offices that were not known with psychiatry. The idea was it is not a psychiatric program, so you can ask anyone. We asked 3 renowned architecture offices nearby. This was Henk de Smet-Paul Vermeulen Architects from Ghent. This was Architecten de Wildevink Tailleur. This was a proposal in the competition. And this was Noah Architects from Brussels. Here, these architects, they stayed quite close to the project definition. They said the main idea was here to create a sort of reduced world, sort of small worlds. So part of the building was kept as a tower, a greenhouse, a water lake. This was the most extreme proposal. The idea was we take the building as we see it now, and we freeze it somehow and make it accessible. So it was far beyond our project definition, but of course it fitted the project definition that we had. It was even my wildest dream that we saw. So everyone knew this was the project to take, but of course it took months to have that accepted by everyone. This was also a very nice project. So it kept the outer wall and created a sort of wild wood inside with a sort of passage through the trees. Because this was a sort of idea, fantasy by one of the psychiatrists. He said often patients lack the possibility to see the horizon. In Belgium, everything is quite flat. I think in Paris too. And And looking over the trees for him was important. He was working in this fear and mood disorder program. So they literally made this possibility for a lookout. So the most radical proposal was accepted and worked through in a design process. So the design process that was also recursive in the fact the idea of commoning the clinic was also translated in working through this design. So again, for the design, we sat together with the architects, bringing together patients, psychiatrists, staff, therapists, and work through the idea. Here we were having our workshops in the St. Joseph building because the demolition was halted at a certain moment. This image is something that relates back to the former image here. Where was the demolition? Yeah, the demolition was started, but then it was halted first because of asbestos. So amiant was found, so that created the need to have a sort of vacuum demolition. And there was a New Year holiday in between, so in fact, the demolition was simply halted. But some stones were taken away for the renovation of the head building, the main building. So it's interesting, the architects, in fact, there were no clear plans for the building, but they created a sort of rules for the play, how to develop the building. As you see in the proposal, the windows were still closed, but then in the final result, they opened up all the windows, so you could walk through the windows and you could enter the building from all sides. That was one of the ideas by a patient, saying we should get rid of this front facade of the building. In fact, every side of the building should function as a front to approach. And then you can even start walking through the windows. The architects came with, there was never a clear plan design, but they came with simple rules, like how to finish the broken edges of windows and doors with concrete stones, or to fill the gaps, as you see here, or to somehow stitch the building, as you do with wounds on your body. And these were the logics defined, never a real plan drawn up. Logic that were discussed and with patients how to take that or continue that. One of the ideas was also, the architects first had this idea that when talking about the building, there was still sort of need for functions. So one of the openings, I will go back in the presentation to the beginning. Here, opening up the cellar, create a sort of steps, but the steps are too big. At first, the idea, or there was a big discussion, what would the use be? And then architects wanted to have a sort of playground, a half basket court was the idea, but then a patient came with the idea, it should be nothing, it should be just that space. And then we can do whatever with it. Later, when talking with a psychologist, he said this is the most special space for him. He says, when I walk down with a patient here, I feel like Aristotle is on the steps of a Greek temple with people around him. Good. Anyhow, so this was the idea. There was no plan for the building. We only have rules that then the contractor should follow in stitching the building and opening the building up to the environments. So this was the opening day. It was in 2016. This is a use by the psychosis treatment program. But in fact, of course, the building is used in different ways, often by working groups from different treatment programs, but then, I mean, not in an organized way. But I remember for them, they said it was very useful to talk about or to be with patients in a space where they are inside, but in fact at the same time outside, because there is no roof on the building, or they think. So to have this, to talk about this double feelings was very useful for them. I remember also talking about the hard surface and soft feeling of the glass, etc., etc. But in fact, I don't think, of course, so the building is used in different ways by treatment programs, by people just having a sit there or having a smoke or eating their hamburgers or starting the fire, because there's an open fireplace that's often used. Wood is provided by the clinic to use it often. People from the children and youth program gather there in an informal way, especially in the evening. But still, I think this is not the most important issue or use of the building. More important is the fact that it is nothing. So this brings me almost to the conclusion. Often, one of the questions I have by people visiting the site, visiting the project, often architects, because it's so well published in the architectural field, they said, then I have this sort of remarks, also by email, saying, but we did not find anybody in the building, as if they were planning to go to the zoo and see patients in that open space. My standard answer became, you forgot to look at yourself. Without that building, you would never have reached Melle, near Ghent. You would never have been there. You were, as a visitor, you were the user. And in fact, as a sort of unintended loop, we realized what we wanted in the beginning, to have a sort of, or to redevelop the psychiatric center as something that is more than only about treatment. A space that is more than just about patients, a place also where patients can invite people, or at least have visit by their family and have some good time, have some time with them. The rotting also is, of course, a huge problem. The floors. Now the first and the second floor is closed off. The floors were, of course, are from wood, never intended to be open to weather conditions. But then again, yes, of course, but this somehow proves that also architecture needs care and attention. Of course, for the clinic, it's very strange to clean a ruin. to now and then stitch it, but still we thought this was, or we found this was a sort of useful moment. And then the safety, of course, it's a very big issue. I remember already, not from the opening, but even before the opening, the safety, patient safety was discussed at every moment, and of course creating a lot of stress among people that were responsible, like the head psychiatrist and the manager, the general manager. Because of course this building has a sort of attraction to patients to commit terrible acts. And then, but a psychologist, Saint-Maurice, came in defense. He said, no, it's a good thing that we have it, at least in this building, centrally located. We are able, as a psychologist, to talk with patients about their fears, about their dark thoughts. We rather have it here than at the highway, at the other side of the woods, very easily accessible, but difficult then for the staff to reach the patients in these moments of crisis. But still, so the building as a problem, this is in fact for us, for the director, one of the most, or even more important than the daily uses or the small uses of the therapy groups. So the strange use of the building as an element to be dealt with for different reasons, because it rots, because it's unsafe, because people somehow not use it properly. Because of course, always difficult to invest money in a building that is so unused as this. Often just people sitting there and after lunch or after dinner. So, but then this brings me to the last point, the design for legacy, the legacy of the project. Here you see in the back of the image, or to the right, in the back of the perspective, the St. Joseph building, where we were talking about, so the open monumental space. The building next to it, that was also part of the demolition program, it was called the Lente, so springtime, was also saved from demolition in the same renegotiation. So the moment it became clear for people, for the staff and psychiatrists, that these buildings could be saved, immediately the people from psychosis program said this should become our next or our future facility. Everything that they had been dreaming of before in the workshops 2 years earlier, they saw it possible in this sort of building. So they were complaining about in these bad houses or the dark corridors, low ceilings, doors on every side, nurse post at the end. So everything that makes a patient nervous, everything that makes that pushes a patient to the staff, and because it's so difficult to open up a door, to wait in an empty room. So here they created, or they renovated the building as an open space, a continuum, so a space where you can see almost through the whole building. The rooms are located here in the side wings. The former cabinets are now used as individual rooms, and the former common sleeping rooms are used as social spaces, where you can literally look through, where you have a short corridor, where you have a corridor, let's say, with only doors on one side, not on both sides. A facility also on the ground level that has many exits. So you can exit so this is the first floor, but then on the ground floor you can leave the building from here, from here, in the back. So you create a sort of open space where patients can roam around and flee easily when they feel this need. So interestingly, this building was realized by the technical department of the clinic without me intervening, without the architects intervening. So the former project was by Architect in de Ville, famous architecture office. Here, in fact, it shows somehow how the clinic was empowered to take on these old facilities and to do away with this perverse logic of the 75% rule. The manager later, after finishing this building, said, in fact, the 75% rule, it was below the 75%, the renovation. But he said later the costs rise a little bit, but we have now the enthusiasm of the staff included, as you include the VAT. So this was an important moment, and in fact, to me, much more important result than the open monument or the open monumental outdoor space where the whole world thinks about and gives prizes to. In fact, this is a true result of that whole process. Why? Because it's part of this. It's a residential program. This is of course much more important for the patients, for the people working there in the department. It's part of this, of the functioning of the clinic. So another legacy of the whole master planning is then the crisis department was the discussion where it started with. As I said, now almost 10 years later, it's almost starting now the works. But we took a long time to discuss these things. So it took a long time to discuss the use of the seclusion room, what the seclusion room would mean in this new crisis department. We discussed new models, so the HIC model. It's a Dutch model, high and intensive care model. We tried to translate that to Melle and see how it would work with the temporary interventions in the St. Elizabeth's building, which was the crisis building. In fact, what I show here are the images made by a photographer. We asked him to make a documentation of the seclusion room, but because the room is so narrow, he could not take distance, and then came with this very focused images of the four walls. We thought it was very strong visualization of what is of the feeling of being in a seclusion room. So anyhow, 9 years by now. The important logic that we had in mind was a quote that I have from Lisa Fior, architect from MUF, working in London. Her logic was we should spend fast money in the slowest possible terms. This is in fact what the whole idea was. We should somehow delay and slow down this whole process so that different reflections can start to happen. Feedback loops can arise. A thing like this open monument can come in existence. Also then this redoing of the psychosis care facility. By delaying this whole process of master planning, this sort of events could happen in the clinic, rather than just immediately thinking of this project requirements for a crisis department or the requirements of a children's facility. Because often this thinks in a very linear logic, as if once you have the requirements, you can give it to architects who will translate it into space. While in fact, everything that we were going through had this logic of a much more dialectical logic. in fact, the service, I mean, the care service that people provide, I mean, are often only debatable or discussable when you start to think about space and how the space is organized. So it's only in that moment that the staff could start to reflect on how they could deal different in that building, and vice versa. It's only by discussing the care service that an architect comes to a sort of new conceptions of what a hospital building could look like, but then in this typical linear thinking about the building process, this sort of logics are impossible or made impossible. So this brings me to the end. I show you a few images that were made in this constant discussion of what to do with this building, where the new fences should be located. It's a sort of constant play with fences in this building. First, they were set on the first floor, then later the full stairs were closed off, and then suddenly it was opened up again, but all the windows were closed on the first floor. A constant play, which was designed by Inge Vink, by architect Vink de Vilde Vink. And here, imaginations of future uses, bringing the greenhouses out of the building, moving the greenhouses. You can read all about it in this book, Unless Ever People, published by Flanders Architecture Institute. Not only my story, but also story by the architects, story by the patients, staff, psychiatrists. That was published on the occasion of the Venice Biennial. The latest stories are not yet part of the book, so maybe we'll make a second version. That brings me to the end. Thank you for your attention.